website. First off, I just want to thank all of you guys for joining us and taking this dive into paperweights uh, and kind of a brief overview of what paperweights are and kind of the joys and the interest of collecting paperweights. My name is Eric Jump. I've been collecting paperweights since about 2007.
Oh,
I've been involved with the PCA, the Paperweight Collectors Association, since about 2017, doing various odd jobs. Currently, I'm the Paperweight Collectors Association Vice President. And this is kind of a fun treat for me. I've been wanting to do a presentation like this for a long time. It should be a lot of fun. It should be interesting. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Today's discussion is Paperweights 101, why, what, and how to collect paperweights. Again, I just want to thank you all for joining us. Today should be a lot of fun. Essentially, what we're going to be diving into is this is kind of like a primer into the world of paperweights, into the world of collecting, a nice overview, but hopefully there's tidbits in there for everybody, enough information for tips and tricks for just about anybody out there, regardless of your level of collecting. We'll be looking at a few different things. We'll be discussing a little bit about why why people collect paperweights and why they are a rewarding object or art to collect. We'll be discussing a little bit about different styles and techniques and touching on some notable makers. Where to buy paperweights, what to look for, and how to identify quality, some tips on spotting rare pieces and evaluating artistic value, how to start, grow, and display your paperweight collection. And then we'll be looking at some trusted resources to help expand your knowledge and connect with others. Throughout the course of the presentation, you'll see, various photos. I'll do my best to, I believe I have everything identified for you, but underneath each photo is the name of the artist who made that particular work. So first off is why, why should we be interested in paperweights, right? There's a lot of different objects out in the world that we could collect, but what makes paperweights so special? Why not Pokemon cards? Why not rocks? Why not coins? First off, I would propose that paperweights have a very deep and kind of interesting history. And interestingly enough, a lot of that history still lies in mystery. So collecting paperweights or studying paperweights can sometimes feel a bit like you're a detective or even Indiana Jones. And so there's just this really kind of interesting mystery about it in history that goes back to the mid 1800s. So with that, and I would like to set the tone a little bit and give a little bit about the history, discuss a little bit about the history of paperweights. Um, Paperweights as we know them, or fine glass paperweights as we know them, first began to be made and traded in the mid 1800s. The classical era, as we like to call it, was between 1845 to about 1860. And this is the time period where some of where the art really was developed and some of the finest and most interesting paperweights were made during this period all through Europe, primarily Italy, France, Silesia, Bohemia, England, and then in the United States as well. But the movement was primarily driven by the French factories, namely Clichy, Baccarat, and Saint Louis. Now, during this period, there was this clear sense of competition amongst these factories and a sense of one-upmanship between the companies and with each striving to kind of outdo the other, right? However, by the end of that century, the interest of the aristocracy had shifted and paperweights have kind of fallen out of style. That's not to say that paperweight making stopped altogether. It just slowed significantly. Some of the factories may have made them still, if they were still in production, but they were probably one-offs, or in other places, the paperweights were a smaller percentage of the factory's output. But gone were the days of this kind of like competition between these factories. The paperweights that were made in this kind of in-between time, like late 1800s to the first half of the 20th century. They weren't of the artistic merit that we would expect to have seen from the classical era, from the mid 1800s. However, during the mid 20th century, there's this kind of paperweight renaissance that was taking place, primarily in the United States. And a lot of it was kind of driven by a new class of wealthy collectors. These collectors kind of made it their life passion to seek out and acquire the very best antiques that were available. And with that, the competition between these collectors drove up the value and the price of paperweights at auction. And it was kind of like this vacuum effect where there was it just spread an appetite generally for paperweight collecting. Evangeline Bergstrom was one such collector. In a lot of ways, I would say that her passion for collecting paperweights was unparalleled. In 1940, excuse me, she published Old Glass Paperweights. This was the first serious book that was dedicated to the subject of paperweights. And Evangeline's extensive collection still remains intact and makes up kind of the core of the Bergstrom Mahler Museum of Glass paperweight collection in Neenah, Wisconsin. Arthur Rubloff was another important collector during this period. He collected not just antiques, but he also had a very fine collection of contemporary and modern work. He was a Chicago real estate developer, so he had deep pockets, and he acquired some of the most important paperweights that were ever made, really. And his collection makes up the bulk of the Art Institute of Chicago's paperweight collection, which sadly now they used to have a beautiful presentation of of that collection, but sadly now most of that collection is in storage. Amory Houghton is another important collector during this period. He was the CEO of Corning Inc. and a nine-term Republican congressman. His collection is also still largely intact, and it makes up the core, the backbone of the paperweight collection at the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York. Now, there's a number of, very famous paperweight collectors all through time. It would be sad indeed if I did not mention Colette. She's probably one of the more famous and more favorite paperweight collectors, and she assembled quite a nice antique collection. Much of that collection is still intact and can be actually seen, or parts of it at least can be seen at the Colette Museum in Burgundy, France. She also gifted paperweights to friends, and she actually gave Truman Capote his first paperweight, and he went on to become a collector in his own right. Uh, there's a number of other collectors throughout time. We just don't have time to get into it today. But King Farouk of Egypt, Empress Eugene of France, Robin Leach, or just a couple others. If you're interested in that kind of history and if that kind of like stuff is fun for you, let me know, and I'd be happy to get you a list. Now, as mentioned, Evangeline Bergstrom's book was the very first, important paperweight book. There may have been other smaller books written earlier on, but this was the first real dive into paperweights. However, that book was almost entirely focused on antique French paperweights. That was Evangeline's kind of focus during that time. But interestingly enough, included in that book was this photo of Paul Isart's paperweight with these beautiful butterflies and Millefiore. Now, Paul was the first in a group of a budding early 20th century studio glass artists who are working in Scotland. He first started working with his family, his brothers, his father. They all made paperweights, but Paul was particularly talented. So good, in fact, was his talent, as I mentioned, that Evangeline purchased two paperweights from him, or not from him directly, but from a dealer in 1938. And she purchased them not because they were, great paperweights made by Paul Isard, but she thought that they were actually antique French paperweights. And it wasn't for a few years later until she realized or was instructed otherwise. But Paul went on to inspire an entire generation of Scottish paperweight makers. And their artistic lineage can be traced directly back to Paul. You know, Paul's like one of these important figures that if he didn't exist, it's hard to say where, you know, the paperweight scene would be in Scotland, if there even would be a paperweight scene in Scotland. Now, meanwhile, in the United States, Charles Casing II began working in the 1940s. Now, he was inspired by antique Millville Rose paperweights. So he set out to kind of teach himself how to build these things. He created his own burner out of old coffee cans that he assembled and made a torch. And he essentially taught himself the art of making paperweights. His earliest output were buttons like these. Now these buttons are, you know, are really no bigger than about an inch in diameter, maybe a quarter inch in diameter, but they're, you know, successful. You know, these are paperweights, however small. Within 3 years, and another $3,000 in investment in tools and material, I'm sorry, Charles was successful in making a full size crimp rose like the one we see here. Now, Charles went on to achieve some of the most celebrated paperweights of this period, of this middle period, of this Renaissance period, mastering both flamework style paperweights and Millefiori style paperweights. But what makes Charles so significant, it's not so much that he is a master in paperweight making, but it's that he did it all at a torch. Prior makers and artists worked in a furnace setting, and with that, there's all these pressures of keeping the furnace on and the expense of keeping that studio running is quite a pressure, right? And so there was less emphasis on production, or I'm sorry, there's less emphasis on creative endeavors and more emphasis on production. So to go out and, you know, spend 3 years experimenting with paperweights in a furnace type setting was just not something you could do. There was no time to do that. But because Charles was doing this kind of at his leisure from his home studio, then there was then all of a sudden this liberty to have these creative pursuits. So he was kind of the first in this generation of studio glass artists in the United States who sought out on their own making paperweights and experimenting with paperweights and exploring paperweights as an art. Paul Jokelson was another important collector in the history of paperweights, especially for a number of reasons that we'll explore. But he first became interested in paperweights after purchasing the famed Pantan bird in the nest seen here. He purchased this paperweight in 1925 for 50 francs, and which is about $10. In 1990, the paperweight was sold at auction for $186,000. So quite a nice investment. Uh, Now, during this period, you know, Paul picked up this paperweight, and you know, in 1925, there's no books, there's no articles, there's no nothing out there about paperweights, and so he taught himself about paperweights by collecting paperweights, and that's how he got interested in paperweights essentially, and that's how he became a collector. So in 1953, he created the Paperweight Collectors Association here in the United States, and that makes us the oldest organization in the world that's specifically dedicated to paperweights. Paul was president of the PCA from 1953 to 1981, and here he is at his retirement, holding this beautiful basket paperweight made by San Louis. Now, Paul did more than just create the PCA, and he was more than just an amazing collector. He was also very important in encouraging and coaxing the French factories Saint Louis and Baccarat, and kind of talking them into to taking up the art of the paperweight again, relearning the art and making paperweights again. So the idea that he brought to these two factories was that we should create a paperweight to celebrate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Um, and I'm sure the factories kind of scratched their head and said, okay, well, we'll give it a try. The very first paperweights that Baccarat put out was this Eisenhower paperweight. It's not particularly beautiful, but it's successful. By this time it had been close to 100 years that Baccarat had not, probably more like 75 years that Baccarat, since the last paperweights were made at Baccarat and any number. There may have been one-offs here and there in the 30s and maybe earlier on. But as production paperweights, it was probably about 75 years that since Baccarat had made any paperweights. So they really had to kind of relearn the craft. Now, it's not a very beautiful paperweight, but it proved that it was possible to create these again and that there was an appetite for them. Um, so much, you know, the interest took off, and so the factories began to explore the different styles, right? So by 1957, they had created Millefiori. Now these are all new Millefiori that were developed within that 5 period span, and between the years of 1957 and 1965, they made about 300 of these close pack paperweights. Interest for paperweights was, going gangbusters at this time. So both of these factories quickly ramped up production and began to explore different styles and techniques of paperweight making. By the 1980s, San Luis had mastered the craft so that they were able to make these monumental pieces like the one that Paul Jochelson was holding here. Now, this is a big piece, right? This is probably about 8 inches wide, and it would stand with the handle and maybe another 9 or 10 inches tall, and weighs about 20 pounds, right? So this is something that had never even been imagined in the whole history of paperweight making. But this just shows, how confident these glass artists were becoming in the craft, and they were beginning to kind of push the envelope of paperweight making and explore new horizons, trying to decide what is going to be the paperweight of the future, right? All right, so at this point you might be saying, okay, so right, paperweights have this interesting history, right? But history is not for everyone. Not everybody's really into all of that, the minutia of what happened when and by who and why kind of thing. But what else makes paperweights worthwhile? Why, if you're not in the history, why else should we be looking at this art form and why should we value it as something to keep and tend in our homes? For that, I would point to the sheer variety. Now, paperweights have been around for a long time, and there's a whole variety of color and shapes and sizes and styles. There's so much variety out there with paperweights that I would say that there's literally a paperweight for everyone, even if you don't like paperweights, there's bound to be one, at least one out there that you're going to be like, okay, yeah, I like that. That's pretty cool. And if there's one, let me tell you, there's probably two. So just the sheer variety is something that I think is interesting and fun, and the fact that there's the variety, it makes it easy for us to collect based on a personalized theme. Or I've seen collections where the collector only collects purple paperweights, or they only collect bird paperweights. So it makes it very personalized as a collector in that way. Some of the techniques are listed here. There's a number of different styles and techniques that go into making paperweights. Frequently, paperweights will contain more than one technique. A lot of times you'll see, flame work and millefiori or marini included in one paperweight. But the two most common techniques that we'll go into today are millefiori and flame work and or lamp work paperweights. But before we get into that, I wanted to discuss or touch on a little bit about just paperweight making in general. You see, the real magic of paperweights is that the art brings together all these multitude of different challenging art techniques, glassmaking techniques, and then it literally seals it in solid crystal, right? So it's quite rare for somebody to possess these talents and the doggedness to kind of bring these talents together and these techniques together, but still have the willingness to want to risk, their labor and encase it in solid crystal is something quite rare and something quite difficult to kind of realize when you really look at it. Weeks could go into building and assembling all the parts that go into a paperweight like this. And then in the blink of an eye, it could just be lost, right? So the process of actually encasing it in crystal is extremely risky. There could be a whole number of different problems that could occur during that. There could be incompatibility problems, annealing issues, distortions, bubbles, cracks, impurities, and any one of those things that could go wrong. There's no fixing it. It's not like you're painting an oil painting and you can just go paint over it. If something goes wrong in a paperweight, it's in the trash bin and you just start all over again. Now, paperweights of this style are perhaps some of the most well-known. Millefiore is an Italian term, meaning 1,000 flowers. Technically speaking, Millefiori are really just flower-shaped Marini. And Marini is more of the technical or general term that we use in glassmaking to describe the technique of using these individual slices that are cut from the pulled cane. Molds like the one seen here are used to build up layers of colored glass into stout cylindrical forms. And then those cylindrical forms of the built up layers of glass are then pulled into rods. So seen here, we have Damon McNaught and Chris Sherwin at the 2019 PCA convention at the Flint Institute of Arts. So if you'll notice, the that cylindrical form of the built up layers of glass, at both ends they attach an iron, and then as it's molten, they pull it out kind of like taffy. And as it's being pulled out, uh, it begins to cool. So you'll see here the part that's closest to Damon on the left is already starting to kind of get rigid, and then the bit by Chris on the right is still malleable and still molten. So he's the one who's actually doing the pulling here. Once it's pulled to length and to the diameter that they're hoping for, they lay it down on the ground and they'll break it down into more manageable rods that can then be cut into pieces for further production. So here's the cross section of that cane that they made that day. These rods of cane could then be bundled again if you wanted, and actually reheated and then pulled out again to make even more complex, sections, cross sections of cane. Or alternatively, you could cut these into just slices and use those for decoration within the paperweight or in other blown glass endeavors. Once the canes are cut down into slices, they're arranged on a hot plate like the one seen here. And then a gather of molten crystal will be brought over and dropped over the top to pick it up. And then another gather of crystal will be brought to seal the finished paperweight, and then it's worked and blocked and cut from the iron. Here's a few examples of just some Millefiori paperweights that we'll go over. Michael is probably one of the best Millefiori makers working today. His canes are incredibly complex, and there's a broad variety of color and style in there. You'll notice that he also includes a series of these picture canes, like these rabbits seen here, and the dancers in the center, and then these figural pansies. Sometimes these picture canes are referred to as silhouette canes. Um, uh, Bringing together all these elements is really kind of what makes Michael Michael. I mean, the thing I should mention is that with Michael, there's no two paperweights that are exactly the same. He doesn't do edition sizes, so the collecting with him or to see a presentation of his work is truly amazing because every single paperweight is just its own little individual work of art. Perthshire Paperweights, working in Crieff, Scotland. I believe it began in 1969, I want to say. I'm not exactly sure when it shuttered. I want to say maybe like early 2000s. I would have to go brush up on that. But Perthshire is celebrated for its high standards, its high quality standards. So every single paperweight that left that factory was just perfect. And their canes for that time period were just, head and shoulders above the antique makers. Some of the best and most interesting designs in Millefiori were being made by Perthshire, but they also put out all kinds of different types and styles of paperweights. Parabel Glass was a brainchild of Gary Scrutton in Oregon. He became well known for very beautiful, precise, delicate work. These pansies, especially, and the roses are kind of some of his signature styles, some of his signature canes that he's really well known. Uh, he began working in 1981 and then retired in 1998. I believe this piece was dates to about 1996. Matthew Gaudet is a contemporary glass artist. These are not Millefiori, but they are Marini. He was born and trained in France and currently lives in Canada. He uses Marini in a lot of different ways, sometimes sometimes provocative, but different interesting ways. His work is not easily categorized, right? So he never really says whether it's a paperweight or a sculpture or what it is, but he's always kind of playing around with these smaller sculptural items, marbles, paperweights, and he incorporates Marini and Millefiori in a lot of different ways. For some years, he has explored this series of quotes taken from important historical figures, authors, politicians, philosophers. Uh, and it's just interesting to memorialize those quotes in glass. Each one of these letters is a separate Millefiori, or a separate Marini, I should say, and it's solid. So it goes all the way through the work. If you were to pick this piece up, it's about 3 inches wide, and look on the other side, you'll see the same Marini that's been pulled all the way through. It's just really interesting and fun idea and use of Marini. Stephen Bamey is another important contemporary Marini artist from Utah. Um, He's well known in the marble world and has just recently begun exploring paperweight making. Now, much of his work is executed in borosilicate glass. And the thing that's interesting is that the properties of this glass are somewhat different than soft glass. So the techniques he's using to create these works is he's directly translating from that world of borosilicate and making soft glass marbles using these kind of like borosilicate. These are not soft glass. I'm sorry. He's making borosilicate paperweights using techniques that are more common in the marble world. And the result is quite striking and different and new. They're labor intensive, these works. Each one of these Marini are they're composites of separate Marini. So, for instance, this fish, the head would have had to have been built out separately, annealed and then cooled, and then he would have built out, the fins and the scales. All these bits and parts would have been built out separately and then brought together to make the final uh, 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 full figure fused together. This is an antique from Baccarat, sometimes referred to again as a close pack. But these canes, are some of the most complex and interesting millefiori made during the classical era, the mid 1800s. They also had these silhouette canes again. The rooster here, the dog. I believe this is an ostrich. This might be a monkey over here. It's a little distorted. But each one of these canes, has, a dozen different elements that have been all pulled together. And so that's what's really kind of interesting when you're looking at a paperweight like this is that every time you pick it up, there's something new and interesting to explore and something you didn't see the last time you were looking at it. Damon McNaught has, this is one of those more popular paperweight designs or these close packs. This is a modern example that was done by Damon McNaught out of Tennessee. Again, a mixture of very complex canes, like the one seen here, and then some of these canes are also very simple. Some of these are just rods, but that mixture of putting them all together kind of gives the eye some places to rest, places to explore, places to look. And then again, he has included these great picture canes that are actually built up using stringers or very thin rods of glass that are built up and then fused together and then pulled out to make the finished cane. Flame work and or lamp work are really one of the same, right? The lamp work is usually reserved for antique work that was built at kind of like older style torches. Not even really torches, they're flames. But flame work, on the other hand, is more of a modern term that we use to refer to work that was created at a modern torch. Now, this style of paperweight is probably the second most common, and it refers to the act of sculpting glass using rods and fine tools at an open flame. And the thing is that usually those parts and those bits are built separately, allowed to cooled, and then assembled at a later point, right? So to give you an idea, with this work by Paul Stinkard, each one of these leaves, buds, and flowers would have been built up, days prior, allowed to anneal and cool, and then at a later point, when he's ready to assemble the botanical, he goes and builds it up separately, brings that three-dimensional sculpture that's now finished. He brings that up to temperature, and then we'll drop a gather of molten crystal over the top of it to fully encase it in glass. Here we have Clinton Smith doing a demo at the 2024 PCA convention, and he's actually building or working on applying black spots to the body of a salamander. The spots, they look very dimensional there, but once he has them all applied, he'll come through and burn them in and melt them in, and the result will just be spots or puddles of black on that orange body. This is this is Clinton Smith's little box of treasures, right? So as I was mentioning, these flamework components are built up, days ahead of time before they're even assembled. And so in this box, we see a whole assortment of different things. We see bees, we see flowers, we see leaves, steep puff marshmallow man, and of course the orange salamander here. Once they're getting ready to actually make a paperweight, they'll assemble the setup, they call it, on a hot plate like the one seen here. Notice there's these little holes on the hot plate. This is attached to a vacuum system on the underside so that when they get ready to encase the paperweight, they'll come through with a gather of glass and the setup is at the bottom of the steel collar that we see here in the middle of the screen. And the once the glass is dropped on the setup, they'll switch on the vacuum pump, which will help to draw the glass down and around the sculpture, and then pull out any air that may have been trapped during that process. So on the right, we have Clinton Smith, and then this is Chris Sherwin assisting at Wheaton Arts in Millville, New Jersey. This is the finished piece with fully encased in glass. So again, here's the setup, and then after it's been annealed. And this was the demo piece in 2024 in at the PCA convention in Rhode Island. Here's a few examples of other flamework paperweights. There's another piece by Clinton Smith. Clinton is one of the few paperweight artists that likes to explore different subject matters. You know, a lot of paperweights kind of harken back to the day of the mid 1800s. You know, flowers, birds, things that are cute and pretty, right? Not that this is cute and fun in its own way, but I really appreciate the fact that Clinton is kind of pushing the envelope and exploring subject and exploring different possibilities, infusing his art with pop culture and just, I mean, at the end of the day, what's not to like about Goofy? Goofy's just kind of fun and cheerful, right? Ken Rosenfeld is a paperweight artist that's working out of Oregon. He's been working in paperweight since about the early 1980s, I would say. But his use of color is bold and ambitious, and I really appreciate the combination of different flowers, the fruits, and all these little details matter. Putting in the little twigs on the underside and the different fruits throughout the work. The other thing that's interesting to note about this weight is that it's not just flame work. There's other components in here. So there's these Millefiori roses here, and then you would even consider the center of some of these flowers to be Marini as well. So again, paperweights have multiple different techniques usually going on at once. It's usually not just one technique. So not all paperweights are flowers and cute animals, as I might have mentioned earlier. This is an ashtray with cigarettes. This is kind of not for everyone, but I like this kind of stuff. I like the weird, I like the strange, I like the unusual. This is something that's in my collection. I've seen maybe two or three of them in my time. I can't imagine that a lot of them were made, but I think it's just kind of fun and different. There's another work from Gordon Smith. The use of color is one thing, but again, the details, the details, the details, the amount of labor and effort that Gordon pours into his work is really unparalleled. If you look closely, you'll see that the body of the snake and the bodies of the fish that are swimming throughout, and even these corals are composed of many, many different elements. Each one of these is a separate scale that has to be hand placed and hand applied and hand sculpted. So when you think about a work like this, there's got to be, there's got to be 1,000 pieces of glass that went into making this one paperweight. And then to imagine, risking losing it by putting it in clear crystal, right? So it's one thing to be able to have the talent to build this sculpture, right? There's a number of people out there in the world who can do this, who can build really, really nice flamework sculpture. But then to take it that step further and put it in solid crystal, that's quite another thing. John Deakins, he's a Scottish artist. He makes primarily, I would say, Millefiori paperweights, but he also makes kind of a lot of different things. Over his time, he's been working for many decades. I mean, this lamp work or flame work, squirrel is just fun and cute, right? What's not to like about something like this? Here's kind of an uncommon multi-petaled rose from it's an antique baccarat. This is just about as good of an example of an antique that you can get. The flame work is well centered, all the bits and pieces. There's no slippage or any breakage or anything like that. The cold work or the faceting is evenly spaced, and it all kind of comes together nicely. The only thing that I'll point out now, because that'll be further on in the discussion, is that for some folks, it might be a turnoff that there's these slight bubbles, but you have to remember this thing is 175 years old. Um, uh, for working in that time period and in that space, we have to be a little bit more forgiving. This is antique, another rose from a different factory from Pantan. Pantan was working outside of the classical period. They were in production from about 1878 to 1880. Pantan is celebrated particularly for their dimensional and detailed creations. And in my opinion, they represent kind of the high watermark for 19th century flame work. It wouldn't be for another, 75, 100 years that we would see anything being made that can hold a candle to this. Now, torchwork and flamework often gets mistaken as the same thing. It's important to distinguish these two different styles. Now, they might have sometimes vaguely similar outcomes, but the process is radically different. I believe that torchwork is as old as the hand torch. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when it came about. I'm just shooting from the hip from the little research that I've done. I would say maybe late 1800s, early 1900s. But the technique was probably first developed by Tiffany and Company. Um, However, it wasn't really fully, the potential for the technique, I would say it wasn't fully realized until the 1970s with studio artists working in California. And that's why we sometimes refer to this style of paperweight and glass making as the California style. In particular, Lundberg Studios in Davenport, California, and Orient and Flume Studios in Chico, California, both made a name and a business and a career making this style of paperweight, making torchwork, paperweights and torchwork, blown vessels and things of that nature. This is a contemporary example that I purchased a couple years ago, direct from Orient and Flume. Here's Mywell Ward demonstrating the torch work in his Hawthorne studio in California. So in his right hand, he has a stringer or a very thin rod of brown cane, and he's slowly melting it into the surface of a gather and decorating, building up a decoration with the hand torch in his left hand. So the finished work on something like this would this would be kind of an example of a finished work. All the decorative elements that you see in this paperweight would have been done with torch work and then manipulated with picks and other tools. Um, Oftentimes these are built up in layers of layers of decoration and alternating clear. So the back layer here was probably just a branch, and then he came through and put a gather of clear, and then added another layer of maybe the flower and the butterfly hovering over the top of it. So that dimension or the effect of building it up in layers gives it that depth and that dimension. Now, this technique can be applied to more than just paperweights, right? There's all kinds of different things you can do, making blown vessels and things of that nature. It can be expanded in all different types of blown glass. There's a lot of different techniques. We can't get into all of it. But as I was mentioning, usually a paperweight has at least one or two, at least two, maybe even three different techniques that are employed. Um, Kathy Richardson, is one of these rare talents that has that she's mastered kind of various different glass making techniques. Oftentimes, you'll see cold work or you'll see cold work or faceting employed as a technique that's brought in to kind of help embellish the work. Kathy here on this piece, she actually has mastered cold work engraving, or I should say like cameo engraving. So if you'll notice here, she's encased these beautiful pink violets, and then on the reverse, she has kind of echoed that theme with the cameo engraving on the back, which just gives it this great sense of depth and just an additional design element that just gives it that much more interest. Now, the fact that Kathy is even willing to bring these different techniques together and go those lengths is what makes her it's what makes this work so valuable and so interesting to begin with, right? So it's one thing to be able to build the paperweight and encase these beautiful botanicals within clear glass, but to take it another step further and then add a whole another layer of intensive glass making technique and engraving the surface, it's it's like hats off to Kathy to even be willing to do something like that. And it's strange and it's difficult, I think, for both the artist, the collector, and maybe even like the gallery owner. It's like, how do you even begin to value something like this? It's very challenging. There's many, many hours and days and a lifetime of study that's gone into building these things. Melissa Ayotte. She also is a prominent glass artist, and she does a really great job of utilizing kind of the surface of the paperweight as well to help kind of communicate emotion and frame the flame work. So in this piece, it's the paperweight, the actual, flame work itself is not particularly complex. It's just a single pink rose. It's beautiful, and it's quite complex, but it's really kind of just simple. If it was just a rose by itself, it'd be like, okay, yeah, that's great. But the fact that she's teamed up with a cold worker, in this case Jim Poor, to kind of fully develop the surface of the paperweight really makes it a much more striking presentation and much more interesting, right? So this pink over the yellow overlay and then the cutting all along the back just really makes it pop and really takes it to a whole nother level. Um, I have a lot of interest in code working. Honestly, I think that unfortunately, code workers don't really get enough notoriety or enough attention as they should. But I really think that you could put together a whole another presentation just on cold working and how cold working has influenced not only the art of paperweights, but the art of glass making in general. There's a lot of different things that are going on there with cold working that are really interesting. And perhaps one day we'll join up again and talk more about cold working. So Allison Russo, working out of New York, she specializes in enamel, hand-painted enamel decoration. So these works are built up on blanks, on clear blanks, and the enamel decoration is then fired on, and more often than not, she'll come through and put another layer of clear and add another layer of decoration, and then another layer of clear. So having maybe two or three layers of decoration gives it this dimension and this depth. Um, I appreciate her work, especially because there's something to appreciate 360 degrees around, right? So it's like every time you can take this work and turn it, and there's a completely different view, no matter what direction and which way you're looking. So, the opposite sides of this one work, we have a male figure walking through a field picking flowers and picking the petals off the flower, and you can make out the silhouettes on the other side. But then once you turn it, you realize that on the other side, there's a female figure that's walking through the same field and plucking petals from the same flowers. So that kind of play on hiding and revealing different imagery as you turn the work, I just think is really interesting and really delightful. There's other artists in other places and other times that have used enamels, but Allison is she's kind of really kind of developed the style and really fleshed it out for what it can be. The Chinese in the early 1900s, I'm sorry, the early 20th century, they also did enamel decoration. So these are hand painted on discs of white opaque glass and then encased in clear. Oftentimes, these paperweights we refer to as Chinese whites in general, I should say, but oftentimes the scenes are kind of naturalistic or landscape style scenes. On rare occasions, they'll depict characters like the legendary Monkey King that we see here. Sulfides are another, really quick, or they're another kind of important paperweight technique that come up frequently. They're made out of a mixture of ceramic and glass powder that has been pressed into molds, and then that relief is then encased in crystal. As you can imagine, there's all types of historical figures and leaders and religious leaders and things of that nature that have been encased in glass over time. In this case, we have Queen Victoria. This is a modern Baccarat sulfide. And in this one, we have Mount Rushmore. This is actually quite a large paperweight. It's about 4.5 inches wide. But it's interesting that, being that it's red, white, and blue and Mount Rushmore, they're clearly targeting the American audience. Again, there was this budding, interest in paperweight collecting, and a great number of paperweight collectors were based in the United States and still are. Another reason that I think paperweights are particularly attractive as a collectible is that they're relatively small and easy and manageable. It's not like collecting, say, like rocks, where they can be at all different sizes, or even books, right? Books can take up a lot of space, and if you have to move around, they're quite heavy. Paperweights vary in size from the largest one here, this is actually a Newell post finial, is about 5 inches in diameter, and that's kind of like where paperweights kind of top out. And then the smallest one here is about an inch and a half in diameter. The average paperweight, I would say, is between 2.5 to 3 inches in diameter. So if you have a bookshelf for displaying paperweights, you could easily fit 100 different, paperweights on a bookshelf. Paperweights can also be, relatively affordable, and in some cases they could be viewed as investment pieces. Now, with and I use that kind of very with some restraint, right? So that there are some paperweights by some particular makers that might be potentially rare that do have the potential of rising in value. However, would encourage you to not have that as your main motivation. It's quite difficult to find those choice paperweights that have that potential. What I encourage more is that you should be just looking for paperweights that bring you joy, right? What brings you happiness and what fits within your budget. The good news is that a vast majority of the paperweights out there are relatively affordable. A paperweight like the one seen here, made by Avem in Murano, retails for about $50, 50 US dollars. And so a relatively nice collection could be put together and assembled on a reasonable budget. However, there are some paperweights that are very valuable indeed. The world record was set by this cliche that sold at Sotheby's in 1990 for $258,000. To give you an idea, in today's dollars, in today's US dollars, that's $635,000. But most of us don't have pockets that deep. No, nowhere near that deep, right? And that's okay because again, collect what you think is important and what you think is beautiful. That's one of the things that I think is just that makes collecting art in general fun, is that it's something that's very intrinsic for ourselves, something that brings us joy and brings us happiness in our own life. Um, the things that we collect, I really do believe the things that we collect and the way that we display them are kind of a window into our soul. It's an expression of who we are. And so it's just a good way or a fun way to kind of express ourselves to friends and family. And there's a number of different ways that paperweights can be displayed. Um, a lot of collectors like to focus on a specific style or maker. Here's a collection of Chinese whites and a few Murano aquariums in the background. Now, not everybody's attracted to Chinese whites, and that's okay. But to see them kind of displayed all in one place like this, it's kind of undeniable that they're interesting and they're fun to look at. Bringing that collection together as just a maker collection kind of gives it power and gives us and kind of calls for our attention to appreciate it for what it is. Here's another maker specific collection. So these are white friars that are kind of displayed, obviously they're displayed together, but in this kind of modern all glass bookshelf or display cabinet. I think it's quite interesting and an attractive cabinet that I don't necessarily really see that often. But again, displaying the same maker in one space gives that maker kind of that drama, and it helps us to appreciate just what was accomplished by that factory, however short-lived, or that artist, however short-lived, or the history. Looking at these paperweights is kind of the history of that factory, right? This collector has kind of gone the other way. So, that other cabinet was modern. This collector has taken an old retail display case that they've refurbished and taken the effort and time into installing LED lights throughout. It's a great way of kind of showing your care and your pride in that collection to make that effort in refurbishing this old cabinet. It's just a great way to display it. It's a nice collection too. I left because every time I see this photo, it always reminds me of kind of like a box of chocolates, and it's like, ooh, ooh, which ones do I want? But this is a kind of like a glass case display cabinet, and I don't know exactly what these cases are called, but it's an end table that has kind of a shadow box with a lid that opens up. And these are quite popular with collectors. There's all different sizes and shapes of these types of tables. And it's just a great way to display the collection. Some collectors will go all out. This is kind of an advanced, high caliber collector that has had these custom made museum quality cases installed in their home. Now, the thing that's cool about these cases is that they're airtight, so there's no dust that's going to be settling on these paperweights. And as a collector of paperweights, that's one of the things that we're always kind of doing. We're always having to go and dust, especially if we have company coming over. We're all going through and kind of dusting everything really quick if we're going to be showing off our collection. Other collectors, they hunt high and low for, it's like finding the perfect cabinet is kind of like another kind of adventure for them, right? So this collector has found these beautifully inlaid Art Nouveau style cabinets. And they really kind of like show off the collection really well. It's kind of like having art display art, right? So it's just kind of a fun way of showing off the collection. Other collectors, they like to kind of assemble different groupings depending on the season or the holiday. This collector has assembled a gathering of Thanksgiving or fall themed paperweights here. Here's a gathering of Christmas paperweights. Here's St. Patrick's Day. There's a whole multitude of different ways to display your collection. This collector is kind of she often cleverly weaves paperweights into her general kind of decorating themes. And somehow the paperweights always just kind of fit seamlessly into the general the greater theme of her display. Here she has displayed some real life orchids next to a grouping of orchid themed paperweights. The other thing that I think is that should be noted here is, and it's kind of fun, is displaying paperweights on a mirrored tray like this. It kind of helps to appreciate not just the top of the paperweight, but sometimes the bottom of the paperweight can be just as beautiful. And so that mirror helps to kind of like give it a little bit more importance and attention. Now, community, I think, is one of the other kind of sometimes slept on reasons for why we should collect, right? Um, I wouldn't have the privilege to see these beautiful collections if I wasn't involved in the general paperweight collecting community. And that's one of the things that I value most about what it is that I do is that I have the privilege to be able to go into these homes and see these beautiful collections that so often don't get to see the light of day other than a handful of people. Now, paperweight clubs and organizations from around the world, they offer a whole they offer a plethora of different opportunities for people to meet and greet and mingle. Um, Looking back, I think that community, again, I think is one of the most important aspects of collecting. And to be honest, when I first got involved with the PCA, I wasn't expecting the community. I was expecting, I came for the paperweights. That's what I love. That's what I was passionate about. And I know it sounds cheesy, but I came for the paperweights, but I stayed for the people. I stayed for the friends. And that's what keeps me going is that, this community really is just a joy to work with, a joy to share with. And there's, I can talk my ear off to my wife about paperweights, and she'll listen, but it's quite another thing to sit down with a paperweight collector who has the same passion as I do and talk about paperweights and watching that, that joy being shared is really what it's all about. All right, so at this point, you might be asking, okay, so Eric, this is great. Paperweights are fun, they're diverse, they have this great history, they're pretty, they're interesting, but how do I get started? Or if you're already a collector, how can I advance my collecting or how can I level up, right? So the first question comes to where to buy, right? You'll start looking around and you'll realize that there's a whole plethora of opportunities out there. You could buy direct from the artist, buy from a dealer, go to online shops, auctions, or in the wild, like I like to say. And these would be like antique shops or estate sales, PCA conventions and clubs. Um, First, and most importantly, I encourage you always to first buy direct from the artist, right? So this is kind of probably one of the easiest and most important ways of supporting the art is to reach out to these artists and work with them directly and buy directly from them. A lot of them have their own websites. Most of them, I would say, have some sort of social media presence, but they can all be found via email or phone call. There's a full listing on our website for how to get in, of registered PCA artists. So if you're looking for ways to reach out to them, there's it's available on our website, and I'll make links to that all available when this gets loaded online. The next kind of best place that I would suggest to look for and buy paperweights is to work with a dealer. Now there's a lot of different kinds of dealers. Well, actually, I wouldn't say there's a lot. There's a handful, maybe a dozen or 20 dealers around the world who specialize in paperweights. And a lot of them have their own e-commerce website. Some of them sell on eBay. A lot of them have a social media presence. Some of them, run auction houses. But the benefits of working with a dealer is that you're going to have a better chance of getting what you want. And then in addition, the dealer is going to do a much better job than anybody else at accurately representing the work. You know, these folks are paperweight professionals. They know exactly what they're looking at. They know when something's damaged. They know when something is uncommon, and they know what is good and what is bad about a paperweight, about any given paperweight. Now, the other place that we could go, and I know a lot of us will agree that we frequently will go to like eBay or some other kind of online marketplace. Depending on where you are in the world, there's a whole slew of different retailers, right? There's Etsy, Ruby Lane. Social media increasingly has become a place to buy and sell paperweights. And then there's kind of like these like clearinghouse type websites like Collectors Weekly or Picklick. I've been using Picklick a lot recently, just because I find it easy to manage, and somehow I feel like it's more complete than other resources. Um, Now, I'll say that there's a lot of deals that can be found in this space in kind of the general online marketplace, but it's a buyer beware kind of environment. You get the whole like gambit of different sellers. Some sellers are not honest, and some sellers are less, knowledgeable than they should be. So there's going to be a lot of like things that you just need to be more cautious about. You need to make sure that you're not just buying the work, but you're buying and buying the seller is what I would like to say. You want to consider the seller, consider, their reviews, ask questions, ask for a different photo, additional photos. You just want to be a little bit more cautious when working in this space, just because you never know who you're working with. Sometimes there's folks out there who honestly just don't know and who honestly just don't have the knowledge. Or there's sometimes where you're working with somebody who's just not trustworthy. So just take your time. Don't let emotions jump the gun. And take it easy and kind of like just consider everything before kind of pulling the trigger on buying any one thing. When working and searching online, there's a few tips that'll help you. First, I would say you're going to want to cast a wide net. So the images that I have here on the right, these are just some of the results of searches that I've done on eBay in the past couple of days, right? So if you search for just paperweight on eBay, you'll yield about 190,000 results, right? But if you are looking for antique paperweights, you'll yield 33,000 results. And the more and more specific your search gets, obviously the less and less the results will get. So the thing that's troubling about this is that you're dependent on the seller in making those distinctions for you. So like if you're looking for antique paperweights, um, you can't, I would recommend that you shouldn't necessarily look for just antiques, because you're depending on the seller understanding that something is an antique and then understanding that they need to actually describe it that way. So there's a lot of times where it's like the seller may not realize what they have, or they may just say everything's an antique, or they throw around these words that kind of like are a little fuzzy, and they just kind of use it to kind of like get the best of our attention, right? What I recommend is that first, get some knowledge and then use your own knowledge to kind of make these distinctions. So for me, usually when I'm searching, I only look at paperweights. That's my kind of go-to search. And then I don't look at anything else until I'm thinking about buying it. I'm looking at paperweights, and then I'm looking at the photos. If I'm coming across a photo of something that I think is interesting and worthwhile, then I'll click on it and I'll kind of read about it and see if there's information there that is important on my decision making. But in general, I think cast a big net and allow yourself to kind of be the driver and make those decisions on the fly. You should also understand that the default presentation when you go to search for these things on eBay or Etsy or any other, any auction site, the default is going to be the best of or the best match, right? And these are items that are going to be having or generally they have the most traffic. And usually that's a good indicator that it's something that's of interest to other people, meaning that it's going to be probably good or better than the usual, and it's likely to sell. It's likely to sell, right? If you really want to find deals, the trick and maybe the tip on how to actually get deals is you want to search by new items, and the trick is to get there first, right? Because if there's something that's good or something that's valuable that's priced right, it's going to sell quickly. So you want to be the first one to recognize that there's a deal to be made. And so as you become well versed in paperweight, technique and artistry, that's what I would encourage you to do is to cast a wide net and look for the earliest listings or the newest listings that have been put out there. And then also, I would encourage you, this is a worldwide market. Don't be afraid to expand your hunt internationally. All these websites have international presence. So it's like eBay.com, there's eBay France, there's eBay Italy, there's eBay Germany. And the reason that those listings are not popping up on your domestic eBay is because uh, of the language that's being used. And either the seller would have to pay more to translate it for you, or if you don't know the language that's being used, then you have to go and use that language. Whatever domestic eBay or whatever domestic website you're searching on, you want to be familiar with the language, or at least the words paperweight in that language. So I know that if I'm looking for paperweights in France, I'm looking for presse-papier. Or if I'm looking for paperweights in Italy, I'm looking for fermacarte, right? So it's like you become familiar with those terms. Don't be afraid to hunt internationally. The only drawback sometimes is that you might run into sellers who are reluctant to ship to your home country, right? But that's not the end all and be all. Don't be afraid to ask the seller if they're willing to ship to you. Sometimes that's enough, is just to kind of introduce yourself and say, hey, I really like this thing. Can you ship it to me? And, a lot of times they're more than happy to help. And then additionally, as you grow your community, your paperweight community, you're going to have friends in these countries. You're going to have friends in Germany. You're going to have friends in France or wherever else these paperweights are. You can just ask your friend, hey, can I ship this to you? And then you forward it to me. And that's kind of one of the pluses to being connected in the general paperweight community. Auctions are another great place to find paperweights. Most of the rare pieces are going to be coming to auction. Now, again, some of those pieces might sell for a lot of money, but that's where the nicer and the rarer items are going to be sold. L.H. Selman, Jeffrey Evans, Boy Gerard, Antonini, and Bonhams, I would say, are some of the main paperweights, some of the main auction houses that have frequent paperweight sales. But again, when you're working with auction houses, it's a lot like working with the online marketplace. Not all auction houses are forthcoming. Not all auction houses are honest. Not all auction houses are knowledgeable. So, ask for additional photos, ask for condition reports, ask questions. Just be a little bit more cautious when you're moving forward. And then the other thing to keep in mind with working with auction houses is that you want to make sure that you understand the terms of the sale, that there's going to be a buyer's premium, there's going to be taxes, you're going to be responsible with organizing shipping and things of that nature. So then the question comes is, well, all right, so you've told me where to buy them. I'm kind of sold on paperweights, but how do I know if it's a good paperweight? And I often get ask this question, how can I trust my instincts? Most people, I think, when they ask this question, they're trying to understand that they're trying to understand whether paperweight has value and what gives it value. In short, I would reiterate that I think all paperweights are good. You know, if it's something that you're attracted to and the price is right, then I think you should go for it. But there is a big difference between what is good, you know, what might be good to you, and then what has value on kind of the grander theme, the grander scheme of things, right? um Value of our paperweights, you know, it's going to be personal. It's going to be your own personal aesthetic, your own personal appeal. But as you progress and advance as a collector, you're going to start to recognize and realize that a vast majority of the paperweights out there were mass produced. You know, they were mass produced in China, Murano, Scotland, and other places. But does that make them less good? Does it make them less valuable? How do you and then how do you even know, you know, how do you know if it's unique? How do you know if something has any kind of artistic significance? Um, I show this example here from Boston and Sandwich because it kind of exemplifies just the difficulty of understanding, you know, how to ascribe value and how to ascribe, you know, importance. You know, this flower is quite beautiful. It's interesting. It's attractive, but there's this tear that occurred during the making process, and for some of us, you know, that's going to be a big turnoff. But for others, that's going to be something that they can look past and it's not going to be a big deal for them. So if you remember these two weights, one of them is a New England glass company. It's an antique, and the other is Chinese. They're both attractive in their own right. However, one is significantly less common than the other. The question is which. How can you tell the difference? And then how can you make those distinctions when taking into account all the various different makers from various different time periods and origins, right? In this case, the one on the left is the New England Glass Company, and then the one on the right is early 20th century Chinese. When determining the paperweight's quality, you must consider multiple factors, including when, where, and by who the paperweight was made. Unfortunately, there's no clear guidance for measuring quality, I would say. The same yardstick is not easily applied to all paperweights from every maker, from every origin, from every era, and from every place of origin, right? You know, if you're looking at Boston and Sandwich paperweights, there's going to be some that are really good, and then there's going to be some that are really bad, right? And that same measurement, that same calculus is not easily translated to, you know, like you know, Paul Stinkard paperweight, right? There's going to be really good and really bad Paul Stinkards also, but it's just a matter of understanding, okay, in general, how can I approach this ability? How can I begin to grade quality in general, right? And that's what we're going to attempt to look at now. First, you're going to want to look at the crystal itself. You're going to want to look for clean, clear crystal without discoloration, striation, bubbles, cullet, or impurities. Generally, the clearer and cleaner the crystal, the better. Generally, the higher the density of the paperweight, the better as well. This especially holds true for antiques. However, this is not a true rule for contemporary or modern paperweights. If you're trying to determine if something's an antique versus something that's maybe more modern, then usually a lot of times you're going to want to be looking at the density. The blocking or the surface of the paperweight should be smooth and evenly handed. So if you see a lot of lines on the surface or kind of like bumps on the surface, that's an indication that it was rushed, right? And less care was taken. So that's more likely that you're looking at something that was mass produced. But if it was clean and smooth and pure, then it's more likely that they took more time and care into building that paperweight. So then it's more likely that you're looking at something that may be more special or have a little bit more artistic and artistic value. If the paperweight's faceted, the facets should be well balanced and finely finished and smooth. And then finally, you're going to want to look at the base. Usually, the better and more finely finished the base, the better the paperweight. So if you see that there was a great deal of effort that was put into to polishing and or cutting the base of the paperweight, then usually there's going to be more value there, or it's a better paperweight, better in quotation marks, right? And then again, I'm using this kind of like this example here, this less than perfect example. This is a San Louis. I failed to label it here, but it's antique San Louis. It's a somewhat rare flower. This is a miniature. I mean, the flower's well centered. There's some less than desirable details. This leaf is a little off for me, but it's a nice flower. It's somewhat rare, and the thing that's definitely going to put off a lot of people though are these big bubbles throughout, right? But other collectors, again, there's no perfect math here. There's no perfect way of answering the question of what's good and what's bad. It's going to depend on every one of us, right? So the thing is that if this paperweight was perfect, it's going to be worth, 4 or 5 times more than this one that has this bubble. Next, one should consider the details and the execution. The use of primary colors, like the Chinese paperweight here on the right, is usually an indicator of something that's of inferior quality. Color's expensive, and it takes a long time to build up an extensive palette of color to work from. So usually the more deep and rich the color is, the better the paperweight. You're going to want to look for the fine details. All those little details takes time and effort. So look for those fine nooks and crannies. Look for the veining in the leaves. Look for all those little bits that could be easily kind of like glossed over. So usually the more detailed and the more complex the work, whether it be millefiori or flame work, the better the paperweight. You're going to want to look at then the general execution. You want to make sure that the subject is well centered and that it's balanced. Inspect for any kind of broken bits and broken parts, distortions or cracks within. And then, again, with that said, I'm just going to say that again, I cannot emphasize again that no one of these factors are end all and be all to determining whether a paperweight has value or not. It's really you really need to take into account all these different factors to kind of determine what is valuable to you. But how do I know if it's rare, right? This is the other question. I get this question all the time. Okay, so yeah, it's a good paperweight, but how do I know if it's rare, right? And I think that when most people ask this question, or when most sellers for that matter use this as a selling point, what they're really trying to say is that this paperweight or this object is worth a lot of money, right? Now, there are some objects out there, some examples, some paperweights out there that are indeed worth a lot of money. And I think that a lot of collectors or a lot of dealers and sellers are out there looking for those home runs, right? And I don't blame them. We're always looking for that diamond in the rough, right? But rarity doesn't always equate to a high price tag. It doesn't always equate to value, right? It's possible for a paperweight to have historical value or even artistic value, but little financial value. And there's a lot of factors that go into pricing a paperweight, and rarity is just one of those factors. But if that's something that you're looking for, and if that's something you're trying to hunt down and really trying to understand, you really got to take into account a lot of different factors. You got to look at um, if you're looking for that one, that top 1% paperweight, you got to take into account everything. You got to look at rarity, beauty, execution, the technical challenges that were involved in executing the work, and the quality. And that is where, knowledge comes in. Knowledge really is power. You really need to understand what you're looking at, from you really need to be well informed about what you're looking at. Fortunately, there's a number of different resources out there, books, PCA bulletins, club newsletters, auction houses, auction catalogs. There's a multitude of different places to look and search for this information. I wouldn't take any one into account, and I wouldn't take any one of these resources as like kind of like the end all and be all of the hard, cold facts. Uh, our understanding of paperweights has changed radically in the past 50 years, or even, past 75 years. And it's going to continue to change. We're going to continue to evolve and understand and know more as we study these things. And so what I encourage is to take in as much as you can and kind of distill it down and come to your own kind of educated guesses about exactly what's going on. A lot of these books might have mistakes, or there might be, they might be operating on the best knowledge that they had at that time. And I see this a lot with actually museums, because a lot of these museums they assembled the collection, 75 years ago or 50 years ago, and we were just kind of beginning to scratch the surface of paperweight history at that time. And so a lot of these museums, they might have some of the greatest paperweights out there, but they're not always going to be perfectly attributed. These are just a number. I'll go through like five books that are my favorite. There's a list on our website, a more extensive list, but these are my top five. The Encyclopedia of Glass Paperweights by Hollister, Paperweights by Sybil Jorgstruff, The Dictionary of Glass Paperweights by Paul Dunlop, The Art of the Paperweight by Lawrence Selman, and then finally, George Coulis put out this series of books, very, very kind of like easy to consume, small books that go into the fine details of how to identify lamp work, how to identify millefiori, and then glossing over some of the less familiar antique paperweights. But there's a lot more books out there. There's other authors that I appreciate. John Hawley, I appreciate his work on Boston and Sandwich and New England Glass Company paperweights. I appreciate also Peter von Brakel and his work on Bohemian Celestine paperweights. And then I also should mention that one of my favorite museum catalogs was put out by the Corning Museum of Glass for an exhibition titled Paperweights, Flowers Which Clothe the Meadows. The PCA bulletin, it's one of the, I would say probably the most valuable source for us collectors. It's been in constant production annually since 1954. Each bulletin contains pictures, discussions, and articles about collecting, appreciating the art. And in all honesty, and I'm not just saying that, but it really is the most comprehensive record that we have on paperweight art, culture, and history. There's a number of great museums that have paperweights on display and paperweights in their catalog. These are a few of the better museums out there. Bergstrom Mahler probably has the most extensive collection on display. Corning, followed by Corning Museum of Glass, and the Art Institute of Chicago and the Flint Institute of Arts. A lot of these collections a lot of these museums have a much more extensive collection that's actually in reserves. It's in storage. Fortunately, most of them do have the collection available digitally. For instance, I'm constantly using the Corning Museum of Glass digital archive. It's a great resource to kind of use as a sounding board on your research and your study. And then the other thing that's kind of fun, I should mention, is that you can actually tour the Bergstrom Mahler of Glass through Google Street View. If you go to Google, pull up Bergstrom Mahler, you can actually enter the museum and walk through the museum as if you were physically there. And so that's just kind of a fun afternoon if you have time. Finally, I'm going to encourage you. I am, vice president of the Paperweight Collectors Association, but I'm also a collector. I'm going to encourage you to just connected. The best way to expand your knowledge on paperweights is to look at paperweights, handle paperweights, talk about paperweights. Join in the on the discussion. There's, as I was saying, there's a bunch of domestic and regional groups, but then there's also international groups all around the world, and it's just a great way to get connected and learn about paperweights. So I'm going to encourage you to join in on the discussion and get connected with fellow collectors. And with that, I hope that you enjoyed today's introduction to the world of paperweights. Be sure to follow us online, and you can click that QR code to join our mailing list. I encourage you, if you feel moved to become a member, make a donation or volunteer. Without your support as collectors and as members of the organization, none of this would be possible. So thank you for your time and your interest today.